So I have finally learned, after coming to Krakow many times, that it's warm here in June. So I actually brought shorts on this trip, which I'm very thankful for, because it is quite toasty outside. So thank you all for coming in here. Perhaps it's just to enjoy the air conditioning. That's perfectly fine. So my name is Nate Schutta. The best way to describe me these days is architect as a service, because I go places and talk to people. And the first time someone called me that, I actually liked it quite a bit. I thought, yeah, that's a pretty fitting definition of what I do. Although, in fairness, I did sound out the acronym in my head and realized it may not have been meant as a compliment. But everything is as a service, including me, apparently. If this topic is at all interesting to you, and I presume it is because you're here hanging out with me, I wrote the prose version of this last year. My wife somewhat lovingly refers to this as a pamphlet because it's one of those kind of 67-page report-like things, but it covers obviously the same kind of things I'm doing here. It's just written down as opposed to me blabbing at you. But this is stuff I've been thinking about for a while. I've been an architect for a number of years. I certainly did some architect-like things before I actually had the title, and I realized pretty quickly that it's harder than I thought it was going to be when I was young, naive developer Nate. And I knew that I was going to have to deal with more of the competing agendas and the politics of an organization and all of that. But as a senior technologist, principal engineer, lead engineer, architect, whatever title you happen to have, one of the most important things that we have to grapple with is technology change. Now, that's not new to any of you. If you've been in our industry more than 5 minutes, you understand fundamentally that this is a constant. When I first got into IT, I missed some language wave, and I felt really bad because I thought that was my one chance to get in on the ground floor. I now realize how naive that is, that these things are like, buses. A new one comes along every 10 or 15 minutes. And of course, with experience, you start to understand how, I've seen this movie before. I know how it ends. I'm actually not going to go down in the basement by myself. We'll just let that one go by. Now, I think this is a good thing because it keeps this interesting. It gives us new things to play with, new things to learn. And of course, the big challenge that so many of us face is none of us wants to be on a legacy platform. I was at a meetup last year, and as normal, people were talking about, who's hiring, who's looking for work, and someone said, we're having such a hard time hiring. And I asked a very natural question. I said, well, what are you looking for? And they proceeded to rattle off a bunch of 10 and 15 and 20-year-old technologies, and I said, I think I might know what your problem is. Now, the counterbalance to that, though, is I can't change things every few months just because something new comes out, because there will always be something new. If we try that, we'll end up where one of my students is. She came to me one day and said, my application has 4 separate UI frameworks baked into it now. 4. Now, I completely understand where the second one came from. Maybe we wanted to migrate away from our original one. Maybe the original one was end of life, or we didn't like it anymore. I get that. The third one is where someone needed to stand up and say, why are we doing this? And the fourth one, someone should have literally flipped a table over. Now, I get why we did this, because the developers are like, oh, this is fun. Ooh, this is fun. I just read about this on Reddit or Twitter or InfoQ or something. And we need to be very conscious of that, because one of the most important skills that you need to have to be successful in this career is evaluating new technologies. I can guarantee you that at some point in your future, you will have to evaluate 2 or 3 technologies and figure out which is the right one for us. I wish I could tell you this is what's next. I wish I had that ability. To be honest with you, though, if I truly could predict the future, I would not use it on technology. I would be trying to figure out what stocks I should invest in. Would place some bets on some sporting events. There's a much better way to monetize that gift than figuring out which JavaScript framework we're going to hate in 6 months. So I'm sorry, nobody can predict the future, but I can guarantee you one thing, it will be different than what we're doing today. And I'm very confident if we come back in 5 years, there's going to be something completely different on the agenda for a conference like this. And I guarantee at least a few of those are going to be things none of us had any idea was coming. So we do need to be very aware of the fact that it's tempting in our line of work to constantly chase the new thing, to follow this technology change. And again, this is part of being in our industry. If you can't adapt to new things, this industry is tough. And it is always tempting for us to be chasing after that, to be on the bleeding edge. And I find that kind of interesting. It's called the bleeding edge. That means you're going to bleed. Please tell me what points of your life you really want to be on that risky thing that no one's ever done before. How often do you go for that? Yeah, the analogy I've used recently, I had my right hip replaced earlier this year. And so as I was looking for surgeons, the person I was looking for was someone who has literally done thousands of these. In fact, the guy that did my surgery the day before at my pre-op appointment, he could tell I was very nervous, I was very anxious, and I was. I've never had anything like that done before. I had my wisdom teeth pulled out when I was a teenager, and that was the extent of my surgical experience, so I was anxious. And he could tell that, and so to call me down, he said, Nate, I've done thousands of these. This is like falling off a log for me. Good, that's what I wanted to hear. Now, I assure you, had my surgeon said, boy, I'm so glad you came in today, Nate. There's this experimental thing I just read about on the internet. I'd really like to try it. Can I do it to you? I would have backed away and asked for a different surgeon. Now, admittedly, it is fun to learn new things, and it's an important part of being in this industry. And I saw this tweet, and I thought it nailed it, really, really perfectly. If you are going to be good as a programmer, you have to be able to teach yourself new things. You're going to constantly be growing, constantly picking up new technologies, and that's much more important than the individual tools. One of my colleagues, I was hanging out with him a couple months ago, and he told me, hey, both of my kids are in college now, and they're both studying computer science. I said, oh, that's great. Do they realize they just signed up for a lifetime of learning? And he just laughed and said, no, not yet. But this is the truth. And I think, we were talking about hiring on stage here beforehand, and I think the way we hire is a little screwed up. Because we constantly ask people this litany of skills, and we're looking to check boxes. The reality is you can learn something new. Every one of you learned the first programming language. None of us was born knowing how to program a computer. But that is an important part of being in this industry, is learning new things, picking up new things. And it's this realization that education doesn't end. My son's 12. He's going into 7th grade next year. And I kind of think he has in his head that there's some end line to this. It's like, that's just not the way this game works. Now, it's fascinating to see how our understanding evolves over time. And there's a great Ben Evans thread on this. And he said, there's things that you understand well enough that you've got a strong opinion, and there's things you just know what other people's opinions are, and there's things that you can have no opinion at all. I used to do a lot of front-end development, and I haven't really done that now in probably 5 years. And I used to have a lot of really passionate opinions on, which framework you should use. I'm really not in the right place to answer that question these days. I have all sorts of thoughts about the cloud, as you might guess. I don't really anything about NoSQL databases. To me, once the data gets to the server, it's like, squirrels hiding nuts in trees or something. But I know people that know it well, and so when I have questions about that, I go talk to those folks. Although, let's be honest, in our line of work, we often have really strong opinions, right? There's these things that we're starting to learn about. There's things we know really well. There's things we used to be an expert on we're not following anymore. That's part of this industry. And if you've ever spent any amount of time in a project room, you are aware of the fact that we're an opinionated group of people. We often have incredibly strong opinions. Does anyone want to debate tabs versus spaces with me? How many of you have watched Silicon Valley? Anybody see the episode where he breaks up over tabs versus spaces? When I was watching that episode with my wife, I about fell off the couch. I thought that was so funny. Now, my wife's a business analyst, so she likes to joke that her job is to tell people like me what to do, to which I respond, no, honey, I'm an architect. My job is to ignore what you say and build what's most convenient for me. She didn't like that answer too much. But I attempted to explain to her why tabs versus spaces was funny, and it got no funnier for her. So, I guess that's just one of our things. Now, I've kind of noticed that as I'm getting older, I'm starting to get more grumpy in certain places, and I kind of have a little bit of this get off my lawn attitude towards technology, because I've had so many developers come to me over the years saying, we have to use this new technology, and I ask why, and the response is to repeat the name of the technology to me. We have to use Mongo. Why? Because Mongo. We have to use Kubernetes. Why? Because Kubernetes. And the reality is, there's a huge difference between knowing the name of a thing and knowing something, right? So we have to move beyond the name. Thank you. Yeah, you can applaud that. That's a great quote. Now, I think part of this is a natural fear of the old. Most of us, early in our career, someone kind of takes us under their wing and basically says, don't have a legacy skill set, which is kind of ironic because a legacy skill set can turn out to be fairly profitable. I worked with this guy really early on in my career who had like a retirement countdown screensaver going. And so when that thing hit 0, I was not at all shocked, and we had a going away party for him. But I was a bit surprised when I ran into him a few months later in the building. I'm like, Dick, what are you doing here today? Did you come in to have lunch with somebody? He said, oh, Nate, it's the darndest thing. I'm working 3 days a week, and they're paying me more than when I was a full-time guy. I said, well, that's great, you jackass. How do I get that gig? But he knew a lot of old stuff. He knew Telon and COBOL and IMS and DB2, and he knew where all the skeletons were buried because he put most of them in the ground. And so what I've noticed as I've gotten older is I've started to channel this tweet. You've probably had a bit of this experience too. I'm the grumpy fellow in the back who says, isn't that just like this thing we used to do before? Is that what it means to be a senior developer? And that's an important part of it. Our industry is terrible at understanding its past. With experience, you start to hear the echoes of what we've done before, though. And you start to appreciate how this is like that thing we used to do. And you can start to say, you know what? It didn't work before. It's probably not going to work now. Or it didn't work before, but it will this time because these constraints have been removed. I think this thread gets at a lot of what we pick at when it comes to new and old technologies. We have this sense that old is always arcane and complex, and the new is always simple and elegant. But to be fair, what really is happening here is the new is unfinished, buggy, and unproven, whereas the old is refined and stable and tested. So if you were to come to me on your next project and say, we're not using JUnit because JUnit's old. Anybody know how old JUnit is off the top of their head? I mean, is it old enough to drink yet? I think it can legally drink in almost all jurisdictions now. But if you were to say to me that we're not using JUnit because JUnit is old, that doesn't feel like a great reason to me. You might have a preference for something else. That's perfectly reasonable. But to say you're not using something because it's old, we probably want to go a little deeper than that. Now, I've noticed, you've probably seen this too, there's a very predictable hype cycle in our industry, and my friend and colleague Kote tweeted this out to summarize it quite nicely on my behalf. Year 1, oh my God, this is radical. Year 2, ooh, this is actually kind of hard to use. Year 3, actually you should never use this. Year 4, ooh, look, something else shiny and new. Rinse, repeat. Now, my only complaint with this tweet is the fact that the labels shouldn't be years. They should be months or weeks, because we've all had that experience. Now, the real challenge for so many of us is, where do we know where not to use a technology? And the reality is, it's trial and error. This is how we learn everything, is trial and error. Consider this building that we're all in here today. It's made of steel and glass and concrete and wood. These are materials that, as a species, we have been using for millennia to build buildings. Now, none of us were around when we first started doing this, but I'm fairly confident we weren't very good at it. I'm sure if you go back far enough, we were terrible at building buildings. We had a lot of integration issues, and they'd fall down all the time. And understand that we have harnessed that trial and error, and we've written it down. They're called building codes. We have building codes in different jurisdictions. If you live in an area that's prone to earthquakes, you have to build buildings in a different way than if you're in a place that doesn't. Now, in our industry, I don't feel like we fully appreciate, and certainly a lot of our customers don't fully appreciate, the fact that we are almost constantly being asked to build something that no one has ever built before using tools that we invented a few weeks ago. And then we're shocked that we don't know exactly how long that's going to take. We've been doing this about a human generation. We've been building buildings a lot longer than that. Now, the best way I can describe this to you is actually show you a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. So my son discovered Calvin, I think probably 5 years ago, which for me has been great because that means when I'm home, he wants me to read him Calvin and Hobbes. So I think I've reread every Calvin and Hobbes strip like 45 times now. They are timeless. I think there's only 2 or 3 that have any connotation to a point in time. And so I ran across this one, and it said to me, yep, Bill Watterson was a software engineer. He just didn't know it. How do they know the load limit on bridges, Dad? Well, they drive bigger and bigger trucks over the bridge till the bridge breaks. They weigh the last truck and rebuild the bridge. Checks out. This is what we do. We do it all the time. Is Mongo a good choice for this project? I have no idea. Let's try it and find out. Will our application support 10,000 concurrent users? I have no idea. Let's try it and find out. Now, in fairness, as developers, we have a tendency to get bored rather quickly, and I don't know what's cause and effect. I don't know if we get into this industry because we have short attention spans, if being in this industry gives you a short attention span, but we are quite literally dogs chasing squirrels. It's like, ooh, Kotlin, oh, Kubernetes, oh, something else, and that's what we do. And I get that, because learning is what keeps this interesting, it's what makes this fun, but eventually I have to deliver business value. I gotta get code into production. I can't do that if I'm constantly experimenting, constantly trying new things. I eventually have to commit. This is what we're gonna do. We're gonna become experts on that. And I will say it again, if you are on the bleeding edge, you will bleed. This comes with the territory. I was talking to someone last summer, and they were complaining about some specific technology, doesn't matter which one it was. And they said, oh, God, we've had so much trouble with it. And I said, well, hang on a sec, how long have you been using it? And he said, oh, like 4 or 5 months. I said, it just went 1.0 2 weeks ago. So if you've been using it for 4 or 5 months, you've been using it since it was, what, like 0.4? And you were shocked that there were issues? And that's kind of the point of version numbers, right? Now, of course, we've all run into the situation where we upgrade, and next thing we know, a whole bunch of stuff breaks. I ran into this with my personal website. I made the mistake of upgrading as I was making my grad students do something. I upgraded it, and the next thing I knew, my whole thing was shattered. So my website is woefully out of date because I haven't had like 2 days to sit down and try to pound it back into shape. So we've all run into that wonderful experience. And let's never forget that pioneers are the ones with the arrows in their back. That's part of being on the bleeding edge. So we must be strategic. Yes, we want to avoid dead platforms, but I cannot constantly change direction. I cannot be a technology hummingbird flitting from one thing to another. Now, it's important to understand that in almost all organizations, we have decided that hope is a strategy. It is not. I'm sorry. The nicest thing I can say about hope is it's what rebellions are built on. We have to be deliberate when it comes to technology choices. The moral of the story is there is a constant barrage of bits out there. Every time I turn around, somebody's got something new, a new language, a new technique, a new approach. The challenge for each and every one of us is keeping up with that. How? Depending on your learning style, maybe you read books or you follow people on Twitter, you listen to podcasts, and you guys are spending a few days with us here, appreciate that. But I remember really early on in my career, I was having this conversation with my manager, and I asked her one day, I said, why did you get out of technology? Why did you become a manager? And she said, Nate, I got tired of being on the technology merry-go-round. I got tired of having to constantly learn new things. I didn't fully appreciate that at the time. I get it now, because it can be overwhelming for sure. So the challenge for us is this has to be a habit. This has to be part of our daily routine. Now, there are gaps in your schedule. You have to find them. I'm of the opinion that Friday afternoon should be pretty available to you. Anyone who schedules a meeting with you on Friday afternoon has committed a hostile act. So hopefully that's available. Maybe it's Tuesday over lunch. Maybe it's Thursday morning. I don't know. I'm a huge fan of morning coffee. I've practiced this throughout my career without really putting a name on it until I was talking to a friend of mine about it, and he said, oh yeah, that's morning coffee. I said, oh yeah, that's a good term. But you take that first 15 to 30 minutes in the morning with coffee or tea or energy drink or whatever makes you happy. But you do it first thing in the morning before your day gets away from you. Because we all know what happens if you don't. We've all headed into work and thought in your brain, today I'm going to do A, B, and C. And then contact with the enemy happens. And you're exhausted at the end of the day. And you have no idea what you did, but you didn't get to A, B, and C. Maybe tomorrow. The moral of the story is your attention is the most precious resource you have. And it is a resource. It does not scale. There's no way to get more of it. One of my favorite quotes about this comes from Seth Godin. He says it's a bit like real estate. They're not making any more of it. The big difference is the value of your attention keeps going up. Consider for a moment how many billion-dollar corporations exist to capture and monetize your attention. Those cat videos will not watch themselves. I actually saw something last week. It was people who said they'd never get a cat, and then they got a cat. And one of the examples was this gentleman who had a cat on his lap, and he was showing the cat videos. That's when we're starting to get really meta. Right? Cats watching cat videos. If you remember nothing else that I say this week other than this, I'll be a happy person. Please do not waste your attention. By definition, you have to be selective. By definition, you cannot read it all. In fact, you're going to miss almost everything that comes out. I'm sorry. Now, I've struggled with this throughout my career. I used to subscribe to a lot of magazines, and I'd kind of let them stack up on the island in my kitchen, and I'd walk by the island, and the pile would fall over, and my wife would give me a glance that suggests now is an excellent opportunity to go through the pile. And I'd throw a bunch of it in the recycling bin because it wasn't relevant anymore. And so I've let almost all of my magazine subscriptions lapse because I'm just not taking the time to read them. Now, part of what I've always struggled with is, but what if I miss something? Don't worry, if it's a big enough deal, you will hear about it. For example, no matter how you feel about Apple, whether you buy lots of Apple products, have never bought an Apple product before, will never in the future, there's a pretty good chance you are aware that Apple announced a new computer recently. And if you check all the boxes, it costs more than a car. Did you see that the RAM on this thing goes up to, I think it's 1.5 terabytes? Go back to when you first got into computing and just put yourself in that place and ask yourself, 1.5 terabytes of RAM, how much of an explosion would your brain have had thinking about that? You know, and of course, the practical aspect of this for us is at 1.5 terabytes of RAM, we might almost be able to run Slack. I kid. Now, the challenge for us is the fact that I can't adopt every new thing. I was talking to somebody a couple weeks ago, and they asked, like, between two different JavaScript frameworks, like, which one should I use? And I said, well, the best way to figure that out is build the application using both of them and then throw the one away you don't like. You're never going to get to do that. So we have to maybe make some educated guesses here. Now, some people would say, I can just trust my instinct. I'll let my instinct guide me. And so Paul Graham wrote this piece several years ago where he talked about this, and he actually laid out some really good criteria of things that he looks at when new technologies come around. And he was actually writing this about Java, and at the end of it, he said, I have a hunch that Java won't be a very successful language. Now, admittedly, we have 20/20 hindsight. We can look back on this today and say, well, Java is probably a top 5 most successful languages of all time. We can have a really fun debate about where in the list it lives. But it's a successful language. You know, I mean, I've built most of my career around it. I know several people that have as well. And of course, Graham went on to say, you know, I've never actually written any Java, but I flipped through some books. That told me everything I needed to know. And so it's important for us to understand that we may not be able to trust our instincts. We might need more than a hunch. Now, that can be a useful filter. And I'll give you an example from my life. This is several years ago. We brought in some new enterprise-y drag-and-drop WYSIWYG thing, and some folks were really excited about it. You know, like the very first training that they did on it, the instructor got up there and in front of a room full of programmers said, the best thing about this product is you don't need any programmers. Like, good pitch, I guess. Maybe, you know, read the room first. Cool. And so one of my friends got really excited about this, and I was talking to him one day, and I said, you know, this is all WYSIWYG, drag and drop. I said, how do you do a diff? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, let's say I make a change to your drag and drop diagram. How can you tell what change I made? And he kind of furrowed his brow and looked at me and said, well, I guess I could take a screenshot and then do a visual comparison. I thought, okay, that's all I need to know. But we have to be very aware of our own personal bias. This happens to all of us. You know, every one of you has at some point or another had a negative experience with JavaScript. You know, it could have been 15 years ago, could have been 10 years ago, it might have been, you know, earlier this week, I'm not sure. But if we let a previous bad experience color the fact that the language has changed and evolved considerably, we might miss out on something important. We need to think about the community, but we do have to be very cautious of the lemming effect. A lot of people are just going to jump off that cliff because they see somebody else doing it. I see this a lot with serverless today. Someone will read some white paper about how this company saved money using serverless and say, oh, we need to use serverless because I read this thing about this company. Okay, do you have the same constraints? Do you have the same forces? Is all of that actually the same thing you're dealing with, or are you in a completely different situation? Are you skating to where the proverbial puck was? I see this a lot, and it surprises me, because you can kind of see where things are going, and you can sometimes skip steps. I'm a huge fan of the technology radar. This is something that comes out of ThoughtWorks on a regular basis, 2 to 3 times a year, and it sort of takes and bubbles up experience across many hundreds of projects all around the world with some really smart engineers and filters it through a group of people that have been doing this a long time. and then gives you some good opinions that are not based on what something is trying to sell you. Now, of course, the real challenge is how do we get a chance to play with some of this stuff? And that's where I really wish more companies had adopted the Google 20% time, which basically says you get a day a week to play. And unfortunately, that's fallen out of favor. And I get it. A lot of companies are like, oh, I can't reduce my developer capacity by 20%. But we miss out on some really interesting things, because that's a great opportunity to say, oh, you want to insert new technology here? Try it on that 20% project. If it fails, that's okay. If it doesn't, hey, we learned something new, and now we might want to use that on a real-world project. Now, I do know more than a few companies that are adopting this like Innovation Friday concept. It doesn't have to be every Friday. It could be once a month. It could be every other month. It could be once a quarter. But you give people a chance to play. And maybe it's not even all day Friday. Maybe it's just Friday afternoon. Barring that, try to get in the habit of a regular Tuesday Tech Talk series. Again, does not have to be every Tuesday. Could be once a month. I'm a huge fan of what one of my friends refers to as an architectural briefing, which is just a sort of formal way of saying one person does research and then presents that back to the team. And just because architect happens to be in the title does not mean you actually need to be an architect to do it. But we want to get into those basic concepts. Why should we use this thing? What do you need to know in order to answer that question? What do you need to know in order to use this thing? Now, I want to stress, this does not need to be a 3-hour marathon. It should be a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour at the most. And by the way, this is a fantastic opportunity to practice your presenting chops. And if you don't think presenting is important in an organization, believe me, the more senior you get, the more important it becomes, and the only way you get better at it is by doing it. This is not a deep dive how-to, but we'd like to get beyond kind of that initial documentation, and it's very important that these be participatory events. This should be two-way traffic. Attendees should be taking notes, asking good questions, bringing their own experience into the story. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What's behind that? And you should be prepared to do one of these in the future. This is a great judge about how passionate someone is about a technology. If someone comes to me and says, oh my God, we really need to use this thing, I'll be like, great, can you do a lunch and learn on that in the future? And if their answer is, whoa, no, scary, don't want anything to do with that, okay, you must not be that excited about it. If you can't wait, which is very normal, that tells me you're pretty passionate. Let's get it on this calendar a couple weeks out, give people get a chance to get it on their schedule. Now, if we get past the briefing filter, it's time to roll up our sleeves, get our hands dirty, and do a workshop. This, again, you're never going to have unlimited time. It's probably going to be a couple hours, a couple of days. You need to make sure that you figure out the key use cases for you and that you build exercises around those. You want to make sure this is as easy as possible for people. You don't want to have a nice, simple setup so that we can focus on actually trying things out. Now, the other thing I would stress here is make sure that whatever environment you're using mirrors the kind of environment this technology is going to have to live in. A lot of us tend to do these things in a greenfield space. We can always get greenfield to work. Every one of you can do Hello World. Every one of you can do a to-do app. The challenge is what happens when I try to mix that technology into our existing landscape. So I was talking to somebody last year about this. They were making a decision on a JavaScript library for their front end. And they knew they needed to make a change, and so they kind of winnowed a list down to like 2 or 3. They went off and did some proof of concepts, and they came back and decided this is our winner. And then they tried using it in their own environment, and 6 months later, he's told me, we really regret the choice we made. We thought we could just sprinkle it in. Turns out we can't. We need to essentially completely redo our applications. Had we known that, we would have made a completely different choice. And so it's important that we understand the constraints that our environment gives us. Now, if we pass the hands-on filter, it's time to do a trial somewhere in our organization. This is where we're looking for a real project that is a good fit. This is not square peg, round hole time. This is probably not a bet the company project, though. It's something that if it fails, okay, we learned something. Now, as much as we care about the new hotness, it is important that we consider currency. Currency matters. These bugs are getting deeper and deeper. The consequences are more and more dire. What is amazing to me is the fact that the bug that was at the core of the Equifax hack is still being used by a lot of companies. They haven't upgraded yet. That's mind-boggling to me. Now, of course, this isn't this space is constantly changing, so Equifax isn't even remotely close to the largest hack anymore. This company that probably none of you have heard of got hacked last year, and it was even bigger. And of course, A hotel chain said, "Ha ha, hold my latte. I can beat that." And these things are just happening more and more frequently, and it's something we need to be aware of. We can't just hope that it won't happen to us. Now, if you don't think you're a target, this map has since been taken down, but this was a real-time look at what was going on in terms of people trying to get into systems they weren't supposed to get into. And we have to realize that the folks who are coming after us, they're little velociraptors just looking for an unlocked door. There's that old adage, they only have to be right once. And this is why we're starting to see a change in how we approach security. And our typical stance was, it works, don't touch on it, don't breathe on it. But that doesn't work anymore. And that's why we have this notion of rotate, repave, and repair, which says if you want to stay safe, you have to go fast. Speed reduces risk because it starves those attackers of the resources they need to grow. A friend of mine told me at his company, it's standard operating procedure to destroy and recreate app instances hourly. Now, in fairness, that's something we couldn't do before. Technology change has enabled that. And so we need to think about that. We need to think about our patching strategy. We need to ask ourselves, what version of a thing would you say we're on? Now, a lot of companies have policies. It's easy to have a policy. The hard part is measuring and enforcing that policy. So we need to ask ourselves, what needs to change here in order to be current? And I understand changing culture is hard. Culture gets formed very early on in a company's existence. You hire, attract, and retain based on your culture. But what would you rather do? Try to change that culture or be the next largest hack ever? Now, as technologists, it's really important that we consider pros and cons. Every single technical choice you make involves trade-offs. Anytime someone comes to you and says, this is the greatest thing ever, you should be skeptical. And you should ask, but what are the trade-offs? Now, this is design and architecture in a nutshell, and we've all been involved in these debates, and it usually boils down to, well, on one hand we could do this, on the other hand we could do that, and sort of paraphrase Harry Truman, please someone give me a one-handed technologist. So we can have these debates. Should we use React? Should we use Angular? Should we use Vue? Should we refactor to microservices? Should we be on-prem? Should we be in the public cloud? And the longer I do this, the more convinced I am that there are just three answers you can use in all situations. There's 42. That's to see who's well-read. There's another layer of indirection. That's my favorite pattern as an architect. But the answer that I reach for almost all the time these days is it depends. Now, some people get very mad at me when I say that because they feel like I'm stopping the conversation. I never mean it as a way of stopping the conversation. I mean it as a way of going on to the next phase, which is tell me more about your environment. And the reality is that in almost all of these situations, it's an and, not or answer. I had a CTO for a while who was convinced that there should be one and only one answer to every question. And that works if you're small enough. But you reach a certain size, and it isn't all that big, frankly, and all of a sudden now we are too constrained if there's only one answer to every question. And so I would argue that this is where we earn our paycheck, is balancing these forces off one another. That's the art of architecture. Because let's be brutally honest, there is no such thing as a perfect technology. Every technology has some kind of a drawback. There's a rough edge in there somewhere. It is vital that you acknowledge the negatives. And so there's two questions I use to pull this out of someone, and this will tell me how long you've worked with a technology. So take anything that you love. It could be a language, could be an editor, it doesn't matter. If you come to me and you're really passionate about it, I'm going to ask you what you like about it. This should be really easy for you to answer. And I'll let you in a little secret. I care, but I don't care. I mean, I'm interested, but that's not where I get the real insight into the depth that you've used this particular tool. It's the follow-up question. What don't you like about it? If you don't have an answer to this, you haven't worked with it long enough. You haven't found the edge of the map yet. You don't know where the dragons are. There's a great way of pulling this out of people in an interview, by the way, and it works for anybody provided they've been out of school for a little while. It works for anything, languages, frameworks, libraries, IDEs, editors, etc. You ask that person, all right, I'm going to put you in charge of that project. Your word is law. You can add anything you want. You can finally add that feature you've been dying for them to implement, but you got to remove something first. What would you do? In my experience, that gives you some really good answers. Now, Kelsey always has great tweets. This is one of my all-time favorites. You haven't mastered a tool until you understand where it should not be used. This is really important. It's very easy for us when we run into something new to invent reasons to use it. It's much harder to figure out where the edges of the map are. So we want to ask ourselves, how would you say this stacks up to the alternatives? Because there's always alternatives. So we can use a spreadsheet for that. I don't love spreadsheets, but sometimes we have to use them. You put your options across the top. You put your criteria down the left. You can certainly weight the criteria if you want to. But now we get into this interesting debate. What do I use for a scale? And people almost always go 1 through 5. Well, now we have another problem. What's good and what's bad? Some people insist 1 is good and 5 is bad. Some people say, no, 5 is good, 1 is bad. It does not matter how many times in your assessment you say 1 is good, 5 is bad. Someone reading it will invert your scale. The worst example I ever personally experienced, one of my peers did this evaluation, and he kept changing his scale. So in one part, 1 was good, and the next part, 5 was good. Then 1 was good again. It's like, you're killing me. So I'm a fan of using these things called Harvey balls. That's these guys. It's not filled in at all to all the way filled in, somewhere in between. Now, I've actually had 2 or 3 snarky people ask me, well, which one's good? Well, fill it in completely. You must mark your answer fully and completely with another 2 pencil. But that's fine. I guess it's sort of, are you a cup half full or cup half empty kind of person, I guess. I don't know. But that to me is a great way of trying to put something on there that's not numeric that somebody can very easily misinterpret. I have found that to be incredibly effective. So I did a hypothetical evaluation of Angular versus React, and it might have looked a little something like this. The interesting thing to know here is this is very subjective. You could do the exact same evaluation, look at the exact same criteria I did, and come to different answers, and that's okay. I could nudge any one of these a quarter point and lose no sleep. Now, the ironic thing to me is, even though when I did my evaluation, Angular came out ahead, I personally prefer React. It fits my eye better. But that's just a personal thing. Now, I've done a bunch of these in my career, and the thing to understand is no one will ever tell you which criteria to use. No one will ever tell you how to weight them. That is your job. And it's a really important job. You have to figure out what are the key use cases for us, because you are not going to get unlimited time. You're not going to even get adequate time in most cases. You have to often make these decisions with incomplete information. It is possible and incredibly tempting to put your thumb on the scale and make your desired outcome happen. This almost always backfires. Now, one of the things that I've noticed throughout my career is architects, typically when I was younger, the interactions we had with them were often very sporadic. You'd be in the project room and like on a random Thursday, this person shows up, writes a bunch of stuff on the whiteboard and then disappears. And inevitably someone on the team says, who is that? Like, oh, that's the architect. Oh, I've never seen that person before. And at that point in my career, I thought, man, we've got some really lousy architects. And then I became an architect and had like 30 projects dropped on my head the next morning. And realized, oh, we're spread really thin. I have yet to go to a company and have them tell me, oh, we have so many architects, we don't know what to do with them all. They mostly just sit around and drink coffee and twiddle their thumbs. You realize very quickly that we cannot be everywhere. We cannot be involved in every single decision. We have to empower our teams to make good decisions even if we're not there. And so the best way to do this is making sure that we have principles or guardrails or guideposts or North Stars, whatever you want to call them. We're essentially trying to create an environment within which our projects can thrive. But that puts us into this interesting sort of tension, because how do I know if people are actually following these principles that we've laid out for them? We come to these conclusions, we figure out what quality attributes matter, we have this thoughtful architecture. We don't think a lot about how to test it, how to make sure we're keeping those characteristics in play. And that's why I think this notion of fitness functions is so vitally important now. Every one of you at some point in your educational career was introduced to this notion of the Second Law of Thermodynamics, otherwise known as a teenager's bedroom. My son isn't a teenager yet, but I was putting something in his room the other day, and I couldn't help but notice that the floor was rather difficult to find. And so I made a comment to my wife, and her response was, pick the hill you want to die on. What I realize, of course, is the universe wants to be disordered. We have to fight against that. Software is not immune from this force. Every one of you has started on a new project and uttered something along the lines of, "This time, we're going to do it right." And then 6 months later, you're like, "Oh, what happened?" So we go through all this effort to establish the right architecture, and we haven't spent much time thinking about how to maintain it. And knowing that I can't be involved in every project, every minute of every day, how do I make sure teams are making good decisions when I'm not there? I can't predict the future. None of us can. I mean, the best thing we can do, I guess, is study history. Past is prologue. Now, the only constant, the only thing that I can guarantee is going to happen is change. Which is interesting because we've typically tried to define architecture as the decisions that are hard to change later, or the decisions we wish we'd gotten right in the first place. But this is already causing us some tension because we know things are going to change. Which is clearly why we've had a bit of this anti-architecture backlash from the Agile community. And this is where I've heard people say, "Oh, we don't have any architects because we're Agile." Now, I've always thought that was an interesting thing to say because it doesn't matter what titles you have, it doesn't matter what roles you have, you definitely have people making architectural decisions on your projects. I hope for your sake they're making good ones. Don't worry, you'll know in a year or two. Hopefully you won't end up here. This is what happens when you don't have someone step in and say, "That's enough, 2 is good, 1 is better." So what do we do about that? Well, maybe we change our assumptions. Maybe we follow Martin's advice and we build for what's in front of us today, what we know. We choose technology that can evolve, and then we evolve one use case at a time. We don't try to get too far ahead of ourselves. And that's why I think you're seeing so much energy around this concept of evolutionary architecture. What if we created architectures with the expectation of change? That's the central tenet of this book, which I'm convinced is one of the most important books in architecture right now. What I absolutely love about it is this definition that they came up with, which says an evolutionary architect supports guided incremental change across multiple dimensions. Now, let's be honest, some architectures are more evolvable than others. We've all been involved with something that looked kind of like this, aka the Death Star architecture. That's no moon. Maybe we get into this notion of deploying components and then turning features on via toggles. We start to change incrementally. We start to use hypothesis-driven development instead of having these arguments without data. But how do I know if we're doing the right thing? How do I know if we make a refactoring, it didn't break some central part of the architecture? And that's where this notion of fitness functions comes in. This comes right out of evolutionary computing, which says take the algorithm and mutate it. Is the mutation a success? Are we closer to or further from our goal? If it's a success, keep it. If it's not, throw it away and start over. For architecture, this is all about protecting the ilities and balancing those trade-offs. This also, by the way, gives us a great place to capture and preserve those architectural characteristics that matter the most for us. Now, step one, of course, is identifying them. And you might look at these as SLIs, service level indicators. And of course, it's very tempting to fall into the category of, well, can I measure it? If I can measure it, it must be important. Be cautious here. Just because I can measure it does not, in fact, mean it matters. Everyone at some point in their career has someone say to them, well, look at lines of code. And of course, if you're snarky, you're like, good, I know how to game that system. Once we have some metrics, we can set some goals. These might be considered service level objectives, which is not the same thing as a service level agreement, by the way. Service level agreement implies there's a contract in place and there is a consequence for missing the SLO. So once we have that, we can start to create some fitness functions, which essentially are a set of tests that we execute to validate our architecture. How closely does this particular design get us to those objectives? In a perfect world, this is all automated, but unfortunately, some things will continue to be manual, and it may take you some time to figure out how to automate some of those away. But let me give you some examples. You might decide that all service calls must respond within 100 milliseconds. You might decide that cyclomatic complexity shall not exceed a small single-digit number. You probably don't want any cyclic dependencies. You can write a test for that. You might decide some people don't understand directionality of imports. So perhaps you have a situation like this. You have persistence in web is totally fine for them to include util, but it would be really bad if somebody did the opposite. You can write a test that fails when that happens. You can use consumer-driven contracts to make sure that my API is continuing to do what my consumers expect it to do. We can leverage things like Spring Cloud Contract to essentially test drive our APIs. Heck, we can even unit test our architecture if we want to. And there's even a .NET version. So we're starting to see more and more things in this space, tools to help us do this. There's all sorts of things. I mean, your imagination is the only limit here. You might look at average and maximum response times. Is our maximum response time increasing over time? That might be a smell. We can look at scalability, and we can compare what happens to response time based on number of users and number of requests. We can track number of timeouts, application failures, and again, look at how that is increasing or decreasing over time. A couple of my students, one of the ones they created this year was to say, hey, I want to know when I tick over to the next price tier with my cloud provider because maybe I want to change something. In a perfect world, we want to alert when things start to go out of band so that we can react to it. You know, a lot of us these days expect that if an app instance fails, a new one will be spun up right away to take care of it. That's something we could do as well. That could be a little harder, but that's something we might want to test. Now, unfortunately, you can't predict everything in your world. You might have to rely on the simian army to help you. You might have to leverage chaos engineering to keep track of some of those cases that you might not have thought about. One of the things I really appreciate about fitness functions is it reminds everyone on the team what's important for us. And it helps us have those discussions around trade-offs. So there's different categories we can look at. There's atomic versus holistic, and that basically just says, can I test this in isolation or not? So holistic obviously means we need to test in some combination, but of course I can't test every combination. I need to be selective. It can be triggered versus continual. This is all about frequency of execution. It could be a certain phase that happened. Continual tests happen all the time. Some people call this monitoring-driven development. Some can be static, some are dynamic. A static one is just what you expect. They either pass or they fail. This is virtually everything based on a metric. Others have more of a shifting definition of success. There's a range of possible outcomes. Now, in a perfect world, everything would be automated. These should live in your deployment pipeline. Not everything in your world can be automated. If you have a legal constraint, if you have existing projects, that's going to be an issue. There are some interesting things you can do with temporal fitness functions. These can essentially act as a reminder. You might put something in your code base that says, hey, in 2 months, check to see if there's a new version of this library in play. You can do also a similar test that says, if someone upgrades this library without us being aware of it, we want to break. We've all had that experience. Somebody upgrades something and we don't understand all the impacts and we get an outage. Now, in a perfect world, we'd identify all of these up front. That discussion is invaluable on your project. It helps us prioritize. It helps us figure out how to architect the system. Now, obviously, you're not going to know everything up front. Some of these are going to emerge over time. If we want to do the best we can. You can also classify fitness functions. You might decide that some of these are key. This is a critical decision. We have to get this right. Others are relevant. Yeah, we want to think about it, but it's probably not fundamentally going to change the architecture. And interestingly enough, you might also keep track of those that are not relevant. This won't impact our decisions at all. Now, I know that seems a little strange, but I worked on one project where scalability wasn't an issue for us. The entire user population sat on the floor beneath us. I never needed to worry about 1,500 concurrent users. I only had 110 users, period. So that allowed us to ignore a whole bunch of things. You want to keep these visible. You want everybody in the project room to understand them. There shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. And you need to review them on a regular basis. Are they still relevant? Is there some new dimension we can track? Is there a better way of measuring or testing this particular fitness function? That should happen at least annually, if not more frequently. I learned this the hard way. You probably did too. Architecture is not as easy as it looked at to me from the outside. There's a lot of things we have to juggle. It is vitally important that we think strategically. We have to avoid resume-driven design at all costs. I wish you luck. I'll mill about if you have questions. Thank you so much for your time and attention. It's always great to be here. Cheers.